Happy New Year from me, George Galloway.
And from me, Adam Gary.
And from us collectively as the History Boys. Every week we bring you a history as you've sometimes never heard it before, of great events, eras, epochs, and great men and women. We don't hold with the idea that some Marxists do, that men and women don't make history. Great, blind, historical forces do. We tend to think there's a bit of both involved. And nowhere more so than in talking about the transformation of China. This handsome young man behind me, Chairman Mao Zedong, and his sidekick, the long-time Foreign Minister of China, Zhou Enlai, were two very great men, and they transformed China. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai transformed the Chinese political landscape. They unified the country, made it one vast, cohesive political force. Sure, they made many mistakes. Something like 70% good, 30% bad is the current Chinese evaluation of the role played by Chairman Mao Zedong. But he is still the father of the nation, the founder of the nation. But not depicted here is a man that we'll be mainly talking about. Deng Xiaoping became the leader after a short interregnum of the People's Republic of China, and he struck out on a dramatically new course, one which has lifted scores of millions of people in China out of poverty and made the country the superpower of the 21st century. Have I got that right, Adam?
Absolutely right. Before going into briefly Deng's background, one has to remember that in 1978, when Deng emerged as the paramount leader of China, although without holding the traditional title of chairman, let alone Secretary General of the party, the Communist Party of China, the population in the country was overwhelmingly poor. 88% of all Chinese, and that's a lot of people, were living in what was legally defined by international standards as poverty. Today, in 2019, early in 2019, that number is now less than 2%, and by 2020, the government plans to bring it down to naught. And that achievement in and of itself means that the history of China from 1978, at the beginning of the Great Reform and opening up to the present day, has not only reshaped life for the average Chinese person, for the businesses, the agriculturalists, the industrialists, the scientists and entrepreneurs in the country, but it's shaping and reshaping the world. I certainly think absolutely for the better.
This is the greatest achievement in human history, isn't it? To lift that many people in so few years out of poverty.
I think that it absolutely is, because if there's any one role of government, it's to leave one's country or one's world richer rather than poorer, safer rather than more insecure. And those two big boxes Deng and the subsequent leaders of China have ticked in a very big way. I absolutely think that while in the 20th century we saw two wars which killed more people than any in human history, that at the end of the 20th century, while most people were focused on the dynamic between Moscow and Washington, quietly but profoundly, the events in Beijing were changing one of the most important countries in world history, and in the 20th century they've already begun to change the world.
Go into the background. Where did Deng Xiaoping emerge from? Was he one of the party leaders under Mao? Was he disgraced? How did he come back?
He was a bit of all of those things. He started out life in the Communist Party as a partisan, fighting against the reactionary forces in the country, and ultimately in 1949, the side that Deng, like Mao, was on, Mao of course being the leader, they ended up being victorious, and the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in 1949. thus ending what had been termed a century of humiliation, where Western powers invaded China, plundered China, forced drugs, the vile narcotic opium, upon the Chinese people, forcing the government to sign treaties that gave away land, gave away resources, gave away the right to control what came in and what came out of China. And the People's Republic was formed with an aim to end this humiliation, to restore Chinese sovereignty and to restore Chinese dignity. Throughout this process of the early years of Mao's rule as the chairman of the Communist Party of China, Deng held many different positions, including most prominently that of vice premier, when in the early 70s he went before the United Nations to proclaim Mao's three worlds theory, which ran counter to the three worlds theory of Western literature and Western geopolitical thinking. To summarize it briefly, the Westerners held that the capitalist nations, the US, its European allies, Japan, Australia, apartheid South Africa, what a club, that these nations were the first world, that the Soviet Union and its socialist allies were the second world, and that everyone else was the third world. Mao saw it, and as Deng articulated it in the early 70s, in a different way. He saw that the US and the Soviet Union and their most immediate satellites were both the first world, and that those in between were the countries that had similar living standards either to the US or to the USSR, but didn't have that profound geopolitical weight. The third world was everyone else, developing and developed, communist and non-communist alike. And this was, with hindsight, one of the most important things that Mao said. And one of the things that Mao said which actually helps to shape the mentality of China to this very day, in the sense where rather than divide the world between left and right ideologies, rather than divide the world between political and economic models, it's instead a question of collective unity among developing nations against those who have hoarded wealth that was originally stolen through slavery, through exploitation, through plundering, and through war. And I think that this underlines a lot of the mentality that we see in the post-Deng era that we're in right now. Of course, he had many of his detractors, Deng that is. A lot of people thought that he showed moderating tendencies, that he was too reformist, that he was
a capitalist roader.
That was indeed one of the I would say defamatory lines that was thrown at him. There was indeed the so-called Criticize Deng campaign, but he did emerge unscathed eventually in 1978. By then, the Gang of Four, who represented one of the most radical elements of China, they had all fallen by the wayside. They fell out of favor with the official party line, and Deng was certainly not the last man standing, but in spite of his stature, certainly the largest man standing.
And he somehow accumulated the power within the party and the state to strike out on a very dramatically different line in terms of the economy. Just sketch for us what these principal differences were.
Well, he introduced what he called the four modernizations, which was a broad drive to modernize agriculture, industry, the defense sector, and sciences and technology. The momentum behind this drive was really, it can be boiled down to a single phrase that Deng initially uttered in the year 1962, and it's a phrase that's sort of inimitably associated with him. It's one of my favorite phrases in world history, actually, and that's, I do not care if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. That's sort of the credo of pragmatism. And to me, if a government doesn't think pragmatically, it's unable to achieve those two great things that all governments ought to achieve, lifting people further into wealth and into security from war and violence. And so it was with that attitude that he decided to change the economy. And one of his great inspirations was from Singapore, which earlier in 1978 he visited, and he met Lee Kuan Yew, a man who, leading a much smaller nation, but one whose post-colonial birth was very very difficult in many ways, as we've explored in previous episodes, he saw that this little resourceless swampland, this little island that no one thought could survive without Malaysia or even without the British Empire, was able to, in less than 15 years, develop economic first world standards, according to the phrase of Western economists, in such a short period of time. And Singapore remains a country with very little crime, virtually no poverty, and it's a place that literally the buildings are magnificent. They're a sight to be seen. It's the envy of many of its former colonizers. Dong realized even in 1978 that the same kinds of principles that helped Singapore to transform itself could equally transform a nation many, many times larger, to say the least. One of the first things he did was set up the Special Economic Zones, the SEZs. These were areas where foreigners could bring in hard currency and, most importantly, take that out, because in the late 70s, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, was non-convertible, it was grossly overvalued, and bringing money into China, hard currency that was convertible, was virtually impossible. Dong said that in order for us to reach our potential, we need to learn from others, and that means seeing how their factories work, seeing how their technologies work, letting them come into China as partners rather than be trapped in a model which prioritized self-sufficiency at the expense of progress and innovation. The Special Economic Zone served as the basis for the economic boom that happened throughout the 80s and 90s, and that happened to this day. At the same time, monetary reform was very important, because Dong knew that having an overvalued currency in a developing nation that sought to trade and export its way into prosperity simply wasn't going to work. So he worked on making the exchange rate of the renminbi versus the dollar and other internationally traded hard currencies more realistic. He did this by allowing people in these special economic zones to keep a percentage of the hard currency that came in from foreign direct investment. He did this by moderating the exchange rate at the central bank, making it more realistic, and over time the renminbi was internationalized, with the IMF in 2015 taking it into the special drawing rights basket of currencies, which previously only included Western currencies, in Japan, which is the most Western country in terms of its alignment in Asia. So that was in many ways the most important thing that Dong did, and he did it at a time when Japan, ironically, did the opposite. Japan was essentially bullied by its Western partners in 1986 into signing something called the Plaza Accords, which led to a fairly unrealistic hypervaluation of the yen. This, in turn, caused the government to try to lower interest rates rapidly so that there wouldn't be a deflationary spiral that would stagnate growth. The results, though, were an asset bubble that, when it burst in the early 90s, created a decade plus of stagnation. In China, throughout this period, we saw consistent growth based on a policy of a moderate monetary policy that would see the currency slowly internationalize. It was indeed not until the early 2000s, long after Dong's death in 1997, where we see the first dim sum bonds being issued. But it was this gradual process of creating a market socialist economy which allowed for entrepreneurialism, allowed for foreign direct investment, but carefully regulated how and when it would come in, and more importantly, how and when it would come out. So far from just selling China by the pound, so to speak, Dong was a master of moderation. He got the economy to work for the people, which is in keeping with the socialist model, but he opened it up to growth and innovation, which is in keeping with the market model. Taken as a whole, we call it market socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I would say that it's been the most successful economic model in history. When we've seen crisis in proper communist economies like the Soviet Union in the 1980s, when we saw 20 years later crises in the capitalist economies, the 2008 Great Recession, the late 1990s recession in Asia and in Russia, of course Japan's problems that I just spoke about. China avoided all of these. So when we look at the author, or perhaps better put, the one who implemented the greatest economic model in the modern world, that man is Deng Xiaoping, and the market model is called market socialism.
Well, let's explore that. Some of the things that you described were introduced 60 years earlier by Lenin and the new economic policy, an attempt to find a synthesis between public ownership, traditional tropes of socialist organization, whilst allowing some level of or extent of private enterprise and distribution of wealth by that means. But Deng Xiaoping took this idea, made it his own, and exponentially increased it, didn't he? Of course, what you describe as the 88% poverty in China under Mao can be described as an equality of misery. As Mr. Churchill called socialism as an idea, the equality of misery. But at least it was equality. There was no grotesque imbalance between the richest in the society and the poorest. It had that going for it. This market socialism of which you speak has not avoided that, has it? We have vastly wealthy people in China, hundreds, if not thousands, of billionaires. And we have people in the countryside, off the beaten track, who are still living fairly basic lives. How can that square with the idea of socialism? It squares with the idea of market, but how does it square with the idea of socialism?
It squares with the idea of socialism insofar as all of the great socialist thinkers from Marx to the present day realized that creating the end product of socialism is a long and drawn-out process, which a lot of people who support socialist parties don't necessarily want to hear, because it's in the nature of the human psyche to want the solutions to the problems to become apparent in the immediate term. That isn't always the case. What China's doing, according to Xi Jinping thought, in many ways Deng's most prolific successor and the current leader of China, he's working on a program to develop sustainable models for modernization of the countryside, of the hinterlands, of agricultural sectors that have been left behind by the Great Boom, not out of any maliciousness, but because it's always more difficult to transform an agrarian economy than an industrial economy, which is one of the reasons that poverty was so rife in the 1970s, is because the government focused less on industrial reform but agricultural reform. Now, with the wealth generated by industrial reform, money is pouring in by the millions, and in some cases in the low billions in dollar terms, into the countryside. And within the next 2 years, the drive aims to eliminate poverty totally in the countryside. And I'll raise another issue that a lot of people pointing out, the fact that indeed the discrepancy, the disparity between the wealthiest and the poorest has in fact grown since 78, but it's also grown very much wider in India since India made its own voyage into the world of economic reformism in the 90s. When you look at how China's middle class is growing, not just in terms of its wealth, but in terms of its width, there are now more middle class Chinese at all levels of the economic spectrum that entails than there ever have been before. In India, the middle class is growing too, but it's growing in a very different way, and poverty in India remains much more severe than in China. Now, in terms of second-guessing China. I'll put it this way. People, from the moment Deng embarked on his great reform and opening in 78, they were predicting that it wouldn't last. They were predicting that a bust would follow the boom. And every one of these people has been proved wrong. The ability of the market socialist economy to weather the storms and have its booms not followed by total busts, but by mild, in many cases very mild periods of correction, is quite remarkable. And India, another substantial Asian economy that started from a different position of quasi-socialism and is now in the midst of a different kind of economic opening and reform, it's been much less successful than the Chinese model. So while blind optimism isn't any way to judge the future of a nation or of an economy, the track record, the experience that China has had, has indeed proved that since 1978, the success rate has been quite sensational, and problems, when they do arise, are usually corrected rapidly and with minimal injury caused to society or to the economy.
Would you agree with the characterization that the era of Xi Jinping is a slight correction of that which had gone before, a slight movement, recalibration, if you like, of this market socialism hybrid, a bit more socialism, a bit less market?
I think that under Xi, it's not so much of a reaction against what came before. It's a reaction to what is going on in the present, which is something that the Soviet policymakers misjudged totally. Soviet policymakers throughout much of the 20th century were always fighting yesterday's battle, always solving yesterday's problem. And talk about Russian influence, now Western policymakers are doing the exact same thing. In China, there's a long-term thinking, which the Chinese mentality, long before the People's Republic was proclaimed, was well known for. It was a well-known characteristic of China. Thinkers from Confucius to Sun Tzu always talked about responding to specific problems with specific solutions and never losing sight of this big picture, never losing sight of the forest for the trees. Xi is reacting to changes in the international economy. He's reacting to changes in the aspirations of the Chinese people. He's realizing that as wealth grows, new social problems can emerge, and that it's up to a responsible government to ensure social harmoniousness, even at a time when the rapid expansion of wealth can cause friction. And we've seen that happen in almost every country that had an industrial revolution. Of course, there would have been no French Revolution without an industrial revolution. The Chinese don't want guillotines. They don't want social discord, and they've managed to keep things harmonious, again, remarkably well in this period of profound economic change. Chinese thinkers, especially in the era of Xi Jinping, also realized that without a solid foundation of sustainable economic growth, long-term social harmony is impossible. So I think that it's this marriage of social stability with managed sustainable economic growth in which we can characterize the era of Xi as a natural progression of the very thought processes among the leadership that Deng installed in 78.
So what is the extent of the Chinese state's involvement in the economy? Would it be fair to describe it thus, that whilst there is capitalism in China, there's local capitalism, there's foreign capitalism, all are subordinate to the state, and the state can and does intervene to correct, change, or stop certain developments of capitalism?
You could say the exact same thing about Western governments, only the priorities are wrong. In the West, you've got privatized profits and socialized losses. Whenever a bank fails, whenever a car company that makes terrible cars no one wants to drive, mainly in America, whenever these fails, there comes the government, meaning your money and mine, the taxpayers' money, social funds, and it's there to bail them out. But when they make a lot of profit after the bailout, no one's going to knock on our doors and say, here's a check. Share. Or let alone, here's a new pavement on the crumbling street. Here's a new park where the children can play. Here's a new hospital for the infirm. In China, it's the complete opposite. You have the losses that are privatized, whereas the profits are still going into a system whereby things circulate. They reinvest these profits into businesses that they know require it and that they know can sustainably carry reforms and innovation further into the future. They also invest it into things like medical research. For example, when the next horrific disease is cured, I guarantee you that the doctor who came up with the cure will be in China, because no one is investing in ultra high-tech preventative medicine and palliative care than the Chinese are. In terms of scientific research, environmental protections, again, people talk about how Chinese cities became much more polluted after 78, but they don't realize that that's the middle of the book and not the end. Right now, solar technology is more widely available in China, more cost-effective in China than it is anywhere else in the world. And they're helping now Africans to generate solar energy so that when the next great industrial revolution happens in Africa, it will be a green industrial revolution built on Chinese technology. And so we see a Chinese system that not only is ready to cope with the peaks and troughs of a market system today, but they're prepared for the future in the following way. Because of market socialism, when the factories that are now being run half by the mechanical hand and half by the fleshy hand, when they're all taken over by artificial intelligence and robots controlled by this AI technology, the profits will be going into the same places they're going today. People will be able to benefit in China from working less in factories and more in other fields, because the profits generated by those all-important factories will still be being used to brighten the streets, improve the schools, improve public transport. Of course, the fastest trains in the world are China, and they're not that expensive to ride anywhere, even as a foreigner. Whereas when the robotic revolution really kicks in countries that have the market socialist model tipped on its head, you're going to see more and more privatized profits, but losses that incur a public liability. And people are going to suffer in terms of jobs and in terms of their economic welfare. So frankly, unless all countries prepare for the AI revolution by adopting some productive and sustainable version of Dong's system as it is today, they're going to suffer. The archetype is there, and it's not about saying one culture is superior to another, or even that one country is superior to another. It's about learning from what works. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping learned from Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore what worked and what didn't work. Today, countries in Europe, countries like India, countries in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, they need to look at what works. And one of the reasons why I'm actually quite optimistic that by the turn of the next century, we're going to see a very different Africa than what we've seen in the last 200 years is the place looking to China most as a positive model are the young leaders of Africa.
Lastly, most people have never met a Chinese person, at least from the People's Republic.
Can't imagine why, there's plenty of them.
There are, but I think it's a fair comment.
Indeed.
That most people have not met one. Most of the great international issues, clashes, wars, crises, never seem to involve China. Will either, both of those things change, and if so, when?
I don't think so. The Chinese very wisely realized that, as Sun Tzu said, you act strong when you are weak, and you act weak when you are strong. Deng was very much captivated by that phrase and said that China isn't a nation prone to showing off. It's not a nation that historically has meddled in a hostile way into the affairs of another nation. Certainly the last war that China was involved in, one with Vietnam in 1979, arising over Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. That was the last war that China participated in any way, and that was really the transitional period between the Maoist era.
That was a Maoist ultra-leftist response, wasn't it?
Indeed, and it was sort of a Maoist hangover that carried over into the very early years of Deng's leadership. But the post-reform China, the post-78 China, hasn't become militarily involved in any country because China realizes that even though war can make some people rich in the short term, in the long term, war eventually makes everyone poor. So while the people at companies like Blackwater and G4S and all these others are busy counting the pound, shillings and pence in the short term, it's because they don't realize that in the long term, war catches up with you. If you don't get shot by a bullet today, your children will be fighting others shooting bullets at them 50 or 100 years from now. China realizes that, which is why they want to live in a world where everyone becomes more prosperous while retaining their national sovereignty and their cultural characteristics, because China knows that this model of peace through prosperity, it's the only way to create a world that's going to be more at peace. So if the greatest national achievement in human history was elevating these millions of people out of poverty, as Deng and his subsequent successors did, I think the Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping is ultimately going to give the world at least the best possible chance to live in a more peaceful century than that which we, not too far in the past, left behind. I think this Chinese model does inspire great optimism for these reasons. No system is perfect in the same way that no man is perfect, but it's certainly the best that the world has got. And I think we should all be thankful that we're living at a time when Belt and Road gives people a chance to use some of the aspects of this economic model to lift their own people out of poverty.
Great start to the new year. Adam Gurry, you are a font of wisdom and experience. Thanks for joining us on The History Boys. We'll be back, God willing, next week.